Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now, said the Apache woman without hesitation. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Snow moved low across the canyon floor, carried by a hard wind that cut through everything it touched. Cole Ward pressed one hand to his ribs and leaned into the stone wall, his legs barely keeping him upright. He had been riding for 3 days without steady food, sleeping under rock shelves when he could find them, his horse lost to the cold, and his revolver the only weight left that kept him feeling anchored. His body ached from an old wound that had never healed right, a saber cut from the war that still burned deep in his side when he pushed himself too far. He had no destination except away from the town where men had reminded him of debts he couldn't pay and where faces of the dead still visited him when he closed his eyes. He thought this canyon might offer a place to lie down and let the winter finish him. He was too tired to plan anything else. That was when the door opened. It wasn't a cabin in the way he knew them, just a dugout cut into the canyon wall, low and hidden, the doorway braced with raw planks. A figure stepped into the wind, small, thin from hunger, but upright and firm. The blanket she wore clung to her shoulders, whipping around her legs. Black hair unbound, dark eyes sharp even in the blur of snow. She studied him the way someone studies an animal that may not live another hour. Her first thought was clear on her face. He won't last in this cold. Her second thought was quieter but heavier. Bringing him inside may end me as well. Still, she spoke. Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter. Nita had lived in this dugout for nearly 4 months, hiding from her own people. They had cast her out when she argued against bloodshed, when she tried to keep peace with traders along the frontier. To them, she was dangerous, a woman who weakened tradition. Alone, she had survived by gathering brush, hunting small game, and cashing beans stolen from a trader's cart. She told herself she didn't need anyone. But when she saw him stumble, his knees nearly giving, his face drawn and pale, she acted before thinking. She hooked her arm under his and pulled. His weight startled her, solid and heavy, all bone and muscle under a worn coat. But he moved with her, dragging his boots across the ground. Inside, the door was shut against the wind and darkness folded in, broken only by the glow of a small fire. Cole leaned against the wall, every breath sharp, and looked around. The space was cramped, rough shelves hacked into the stone, a low fire pit dug into dirt, smoke venting through a crack in the roof. There was a line with clothes drying, a crate for food, a pot steaming with beans. The air was thick with smoke and the faint sour smell of damp leather. He turned his eyes back to the woman. She was younger than he expected, maybe 24, 25, but her face carried lines that only hard days cut. Her cheekbones were sharp, lips chapped from cold, and her dress torn at the seams. The shoulder cloth had given way, exposing more of her skin than she meant to, and the neckline hung loose, slipping when she bent near the fire. The skirt had ripped along the thigh, showing strong legs that had carried her across rough ground. None of it was done for beauty, yet beauty was there, unavoidable, rough, and real. Nita crouched by the fire and dipped a rag into hot water, wringing it out before pressing it against his eyebrow. Cole winced at the sting, but didn't pull away. His eyes stayed fixed on her fingers, steady, careful, unafraid. He thought of how long it had been since anyone had touched him without anger. Since before the war, maybe. You're bleeding, she said quietly. Her English was careful, the words shaped with effort but firm. It'll stop, he muttered, voice rough. He wanted to explain why he was there, what had happened, but the words stuck. He wasn't sure if he even knew himself anymore. She handed him a bowl. Eat, then talk. The beans were plain, but when he tasted them, his chest tightened with relief. He ate slow, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he was ashamed of how hungry he was. Across from him, Nita took her own bowl, watching him between bites. She wondered if she had made a mistake. A white man inside her shelter could bring patrols, questions, punishment if she was found. But she also saw his exhaustion, the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon, the scar along his jaw, the weight in his eyes. This man had been broken before she found him, and some part of her couldn't leave him to die on the canyon floor. Cole felt the heat of the fire on his face and the weight of her stare. He knew she was measuring him, whether he was worth the risk. He wondered the same about her. Could she be trusted? Or would she hand him over the first time it meant saving herself? He looked at the dugout, at the fire, at the woman across from him, and for the first time in months, he felt the smallest pull of something he hadn't let himself think about. Maybe there was a reason to keep moving. Maybe there was a reason to stay alive. The silence between them wasn't easy, but it wasn't empty either. It was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. The morning light pressed through the thin seam above the dugout door, pale and sharp, and Cole opened his eyes to the sound of the fire being stoked. His back ached from the hard floor, his ribs sore from too many nights without proper rest, but the heat in the room and the smell of coffee steadied him. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then he saw her, kneeling by the fire, hair loose down her back, blankets slipping from her shoulders as she poured boiling water into a tin cup. He watched her in silence, studying details he had missed the night before. The dugout wasn't just a hole in the canyon wall. It had been lived in, worked into something more. The shelves cut smooth enough to hold jars. The floor swept of dirt near the sleeping shelf. The fire ring built with care, so smoke drifted up through the vent instead of choking the room. This was survival shaped by patience, not luck. Cole shifted and winced at the pull in his ribs. She turned her head at the sound, eyes steady on him, and handed him the cup. Coffee. Strong. He nodded, wrapping his hands around the tin. The heat bit at his palms, but he welcomed it. "You've been here long," he said, his voice rasped with sleep. "Since the first snow." She kept her eyes on the fire as she answered. "For moons. I do not count days." He thought on that. 4 months alone, hunted by her own, with nothing but a dugout and whatever she could steal or trade for. The idea of it carried weight. He wanted to ask why she had been cast out, but something about the sharpness of her shoulders stopped him. He knew what exile felt like. He carried his own in every mile he walked. Nita broke the silence instead. "Why are you here, cowboy? This canyon is not close to your towns." Cole stared at the coffee, then at his boots lined against the wall. "I left town with nothing worth taking. No work, no horse. I just kept walking." He paused, realizing how little sense that made spoken out loud. "I fought in the war. When it ended, there wasn't a place left for me. Been drifting since." She studied him, lips pressed tight. He had answered, but not enough. She could see it. His body told more than his words. Scar along his ribs, limp in his leg, lines around his eyes carved deeper than his age. He wasn't just wandering. He was running from something. Cole shifted the cup in his hands, uneasy under her gaze. "You live out here alone. How do you keep safe?" Nita's expression hardened. "I keep low. I watch the rim. I know where to hide. My people." She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "They do not forgive me. If they see me, they will finish what they started." He wanted to ask what that meant exactly, but her voice carried enough steel that he didn't push. Instead, he nodded. "You built this place with your own hands." "Not all. My father knew of it. Traders dug here once. When they left, I took it." She sat back on her heels and wrapped the blanket tight. "It is not a home, only a place to not die." The words sat heavy in the room. Cole felt them more than he wanted to. He thought about the farm he had once owned in Missouri, burned out before the war even ended, his wife buried in ground he never saw again. He knew what it was to live in a place only to not die. The silence stretched, but it was not the sharp kind anymore. It was the kind where both people waited for the other to move. Nita rose and pulled a small sack from the shelf. "Beans for later. We will need water." She looked at him then, weighing him. "You can walk." He grunted and pushed himself to his feet, steadying on the wall. His body hurt, but he forced it to move. "I can walk." At the door, she paused, hand on the bar. "One thing," she said. "If riders come, if my people come, you do not speak. You do not show yourself. Understand?" Cole met her eyes, dark and steady in the thin light. "I understand." When she opened the door, the cold air hit them hard, snow bright against the canyon floor. Cole squinted against the glare. Following her, as she moved sure-footed down the trail to the creek. She carried a clay jug, her blanket now tied around her waist, and he noticed how careful she was with every step, scanning the rim, listening for sound. She was smaller than him, but there was nothing fragile in the way she moved. At the creek, she crouched and broke the thin crust of ice with a stone, filling the jug while he kept watch. His hand brushed her elbow when she nearly slipped, steadying her without thinking. She didn't pull away. For a brief moment, her eyes lifted to his, softer than before. By the time they climbed back to the dugout, the air between them had shifted. It was still cautious, still heavy with questions, but it carried a thread of something else, a fragile decision made on both sides. He would not leave yet. She would not push him out. That night, when she set 2 bowls of beans on the floor and pushed the larger one toward him before taking her own, he noticed. And when he slid half of it back to her, without a word, she noticed too. The next morning came with a hard frost, the kind that glazed the edges of the creek and made the dugout door stiff in its frame. Cole woke to the scrape of metal on wood and saw Nita at the fire, stirring beans with the tip of a knife. Her blanket had slipped from her shoulders, and the torn dress she wore was patched poorly at the seam with twine. He sat up slow, ribs aching, and realized he had questions that had been turning in his head since the night before. He hadn't asked them yet, but he knew anyone listening to this story would wonder them all the same. Why was she still alone after months? Why did her people cast her out so harshly? And how had she survived in a canyon that could kill a man in a single night? He cleared his throat. You said they would finish what they started if they found you. What did they start? Nita's eyes stayed on the beans. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was flat, controlled. They call me traitor. Said I care more for traitors than for blood. I spoke against a raid. I gave food to a man who was starving, a white man. That was enough. They tied me to a post for a day. When they cut me free, they told me to walk and never come back. Cole studied her face. No trace of pity there, only a calm hardness. She had repeated this story to herself enough times that it had become fact, not wound. Still, the way her jaw tightened told him the memory burned even now. He didn't press further. Instead, he asked the second question that had followed him since he stepped into her dugout. How do you keep food? For months here, it's more than what you have on that shelf. Her mouth tugged into something almost like a smirk. You think I live only on beans? I trap rabbits, sometimes a goat if one strays. Traders pass close when snow is less. I take what I need. Her eyes flicked to him, and I am not afraid to steal. Cole nodded once. He respected that answer. Survival didn't leave room for pride. After they ate, she handed him an axe with a short handle, the head dull but workable. Wood. We need more. He followed her outside, the cold biting sharper than yesterday. The canyon stretched wide, the snow piled against rock walls. He set the axe into a block of juniper, shoulders burning with the effort. Each strike sent pain through his ribs, but he kept at it, teeth clenched. She watched from a few steps away, her jug balanced on her hip as she checked the sky, the rim, every shadow. He noticed that she never let herself relax fully, not even for a breath. At one point, she stepped close to show him how she stacked brush against the wall to keep snow from pressing in through the cracks. Her hand brushed his as they worked, and she didn't pull back. He caught the scent of her hair, smoke, and earth, and felt a strange weight lift in his chest. By midday, they carried water again from the creek. The ice was thicker, and when Nita leaned to break it, she slipped on the slick stone. Cole caught her at the waist before she fell. For a moment, she stayed there, her body pressed to his, breath quick from the scare. Her eyes rose to his, guarded but softer than before, and he felt something shift between them. Neither of them said it, but both knew it. When they came back to the dugout, she set 2 bowls on the ground again. As before, she pushed the larger toward him. But this time, when he slid part of it back, she smiled faintly, almost hidden in the shadow of the firelight. The silence that followed wasn't suspicion anymore. It was the beginning of trust, rough and unspoken. Cole understood then that neither of them would ask the other to leave, not yet. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the pull of belonging. The fourth morning in the canyon brought a sharper wind. Cole rose stiffly, ribs still sore though less than before, and noticed the dugout felt colder than it had on the earlier nights. He checked the roof seam and saw fresh snow had pressed into the clay, forming a thin crack where air slipped through. He thought back on the days since he arrived, splitting wood, carrying water, patching walls, and realized what listeners might ask. How could this small dugout truly stand against a winter like this? How had Nita survived here alone for months without someone to help? And what dangers truly pressed at the edges of this canyon? He decided to ask her as he worked. How long can this place hold if the snow keeps pushing? Nita was kneeling near the fire, hair in a single braid, dress pulled tight at the waist with a strip of hide. She looked up at the roof seam, then back at him. Long enough. I meant it every storm. Traders dug it strong. They left, I stayed. Alone is harder, but no one tells you to leave. He studied her as she said it. Alone meant safety from her people, but it also meant exposure if anyone else found her. And what about them? He asked. The ones you said would finish what they started. Do they come this way? Her jaw tensed, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then she said quietly, sometimes. Scouts. They check for food, for signs. I watched the rim. That was when Cole stepped outside to bring in wood, and as he lifted his head, he froze. Across the rim, far above the dugout, 3 silhouettes moved. Riders against the pale sky, too far to make out faces but close enough that he knew they weren't strangers to her. They lingered for a moment, looking down, before the canyon wall swallowed them. He carried the wood inside without speaking. Nita saw his face and knew before he said anything. She closed the door, set the bar, and went to the sleeping shelf where a flat stone covered a hollow. From it she drew a small bow, a handful of arrows, and a carved charm. She pressed the charm to her lips, then set it back in the hollow. Cole watched uneasy. He realized the dugout wasn't just shelter, it was also a trap if anyone chose to come close. He thought of leaving, of sparing her the danger, but the idea felt wrong now. He had eaten her food, taken her shelter, steadied her when she slipped. Walking away now would mean leaving her to face those riders alone. They saw nothing, she said finally, though her voice was thin. The snow hides tracks. Cole sat by the fire, jaw tight. He pulled his revolver from under his coat, checked the cylinder, then wrapped it in cloth and tucked it beneath the blanket by the wall. If they come, I'll keep out of sight. But if they push through that door... She stopped him with a look. If they come, we hide you. They will not spare me if you are found. Her words sat heavy between them, and both knew what was true. Hiding him was already a risk. Still, she had not pushed him out. As dusk fell, Cole took his turn patching the roof seam with clay and brush while Nita ground dried beans into meal. She kept glancing at the door, listening for sounds that weren't there. Inside, the fire painted her face in warm light, her collarbone catching its glow where the torn dress slipped as she worked. She noticed him watching once and met his eyes, holding them longer than before. When they settled in for the night, Nita lay with her back to him, her body tense beneath the blanket. Cole listened to the wind at the door and thought of the riders on the rim. He wondered if they would return tomorrow or the next day, and if she had been hiding here all this time only to be discovered now that he had come. He also wondered if that mattered anymore, because for the first time in years, he didn't want to keep walking. He wanted to stay. Snow came again that night, heavier than before, and the dugout creaked under its weight. Cole lay awake, listening to the wind drag across the canyon, his ribs throbbing where the cold had sunk in. He could hear Nita breathing just a few feet away, steady but not deep enough for real sleep. He realized she never slept fully, always half alert, and it made him wonder, how had she lasted 4 months like this without losing her mind to fear? Listeners would ask that too. How had she kept herself sane? What had she held on to when each night could have been her last? He thought about asking, but he already knew the answer was likely as plain as survival itself. Work, watch, endure. By morning, the dugout was half buried in snow, the door hard to push open. Cole shouldered it until the drift gave way, a wave of white spilling inside. He grunted at the effort, pain flaring in his ribs. Nita hurried to help, pushing with both hands. Together they cleared enough space to get out, and the air outside cut sharper than any blade. They worked in silence for the first hour, him chopping wood, her hauling snow away from the door. At one point she stopped and stared at him. "Why you stay?" she asked suddenly. "You saw the riders. You know the risk." He leaned on the axe handle, catching his breath. The question had been circling since yesterday. "Because I've been running too long. No camp, no home, just us behind me. If I leave now, I'm back to nothing." Her eyes stayed on him, steady and searching. "And if they find you here? If they kill me for hiding you?" "I'll answer for myself," he said. "Not you." She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. She only turned back to the snow, jaw tight. Later, when the chores were done, she sat by the fire and mended her dress with a needle pulled from a small leather pouch. Cole noticed her hands, calloused strong, but trembling slightly as she worked the thread. He realized she had very little left. Just a dress, a blanket, and this dugout. And still she had taken him in. He shifted closer to the fire, stretching his sore leg. "What do you do when you're alone here? When there's no snow to clear, no wood to cut?" She looked at him, as if surprised by the question. "I keep watch. I think. Sometimes I sing. Quiet, so no one hears." Her lips pressed together. "Sometimes I talk to myself." Cole nodded slowly. He understood. Loneliness could gnaw at a person worse than hunger. The hours passed with small tasks. She showed him where she had laid traps along the creek bed. He reset one with her, his hand brushing hers as they worked the wire. She didn't pull away. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people who didn't need to explain every motion. That night, while the fire burned low, Nita sat closer than before. The dugout felt smaller, the air thicker with heat. She leaned against him briefly, her shoulder touching his arm. Cole felt the weight of it, simple but grounding. His chest tightened, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar feeling of someone choosing to rest against him. She spoke soft, almost a whisper. "If they come back, we must be ready." He turned his head toward her, catching the firelight on her face, the braids slipping loose against her cheek. "We will be." For a long time, neither moved. The fire popped, smoke drifted up, and outside the wind howled. Cole thought of the emptiness he had carried for years, and how strange it was to feel it lifting now inside this narrow dugout carved from stone. Nita thought of the risk she had taken by pulling him in, and how she no longer wished she had left him in the snow. When she reached for his hand under the blanket, leaving it there without a word, he closed his fingers around hers. And for the first time since they met, both of them let themselves breathe without fear. The storm passed by morning, leaving the canyon floor buried in white. The dugout door groaned when Cole shoved it open, the snowbank nearly to his chest. He climbed out first, boots sinking deep, and dragged a narrow path with the axe handle. Nita followed, jug in hand, her breath showing in sharp bursts as she moved carefully across the drift. For the first time since he arrived, he saw her laugh faintly when she nearly fell waist-deep in the snow and pulled herself out, shaking her head at him as if daring him to comment. It struck him that listeners would wonder, could these two, so different, really share anything beyond the need to survive? Could a banished Apache woman and a war-worn drifter find trust strong enough to hold against the weight of the world? Cole didn't have the answer yet, but something inside him was already forming one. At the creek, the ice was thicker. Cole used the butt of the axe to break it, while Nita crouched close, scooping water into the jug. When she handed it up, her fingers brushed his, cold and trembling, and for a moment she let her hand linger against his glove before pulling it back. Neither said a word. They returned to the dugout with their clothes stiff from frost, and Nita worked quickly to strip the wet blanket from her shoulders, hanging it by the fire. Cole sat on the ground, rubbing his hands together, ribs aching from the work. He noticed her shivering and passed his coat toward her. She hesitated, eyes narrowing. "You'll freeze." "I've frozen before," he said. "Don't make me watch it happen again." She took it finally, slipping it over her torn dress. The coat swallowed her frame, sleeves too long, shoulders too broad, but the way she pulled it tight said more than thanks. She settled near the fire, her eyes dropping to the embers, her lips pressing together as if holding back something she hadn't said in a long time. Cole leaned back against the wall, studying her. The questions pressed at him again, the kind any listener would ask. Why hadn't she left this canyon? Why hadn't she sought another tribe, another camp, another way? He asked it plain. You could have gone anywhere. Why stay here? Nita's eyes lifted, dark and steady. Where would I go? To the people who call me traitor? To the towns that spit at me because of my blood? Here, no one tells me I don't belong. The truth of it sat heavy between them. Cole understood more than he wanted to admit. He too had nowhere left to belong, no one waiting, no one calling him home. For both of them, this canyon wasn't choice. It was the last place the world hadn't taken. As night fell, the fire burned low. Nita sat close enough that her knee brushed his. The coat hung loose at her chest where the button strained, the firelight catching the line of her collarbone and the curve of her throat. Cole tried not to stare, but the air between them was different now, charged in a way that made silence louder. She shifted, her braids slipping across her shoulder, and her eyes found his. For a long moment, they only looked at one another. No words, just the weight of weeks of loneliness pressing into the space they shared. Then she leaned, slow and steady, and pressed her lips to his. It was light at first, uncertain, but he answered, his hand rising to her jaw. The kiss deepened, careful but sure, heat mixing with the sound of their breaths. Her hand slid to his chest, fingers pressing against the scar beneath his shirt as if testing whether he was real. He drew her closer, his thumb brushing the side of her neck. And for the first time since he had stumbled into the canyon, he felt the ache of survival give way to something else, something that made sense. When they pulled apart, both of them stayed close, foreheads nearly touching. She whispered, "You can go when the thaw comes." "I could," he answered, his voice low, steady. "But I won't." She searched his face, as if weighing the truth of it, then let out a slow breath. Instead of pulling away, she stayed beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. The fire crackled, the wind moved across the canyon, and for the first time, the dugout felt less like a place to hide and more like a place to live. The next day began uneasy, the kind of stillness that made Cole's skin prickle. The snow had hardened to a crust, the canyon quiet except for the distant call of crows. He rose before Nita stirred, stepping outside to check the path they had cleared. His boots broke through the icy surface, each crunch too loud in his ears. He scanned the rim, and that was when he saw them. Fresh tracks pressed into the snow, not theirs. Horses, at least 3. When he came back inside, Nita was sitting at the fire, her hair loose around her shoulders. She saw his face and tensed before he even spoke. "Riders?" she asked. He nodded, past the rim in the night. "Might come back." Her eyes dropped to the fire for a long moment. Then she stood, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Then we prepare." This was the part any listener would wonder. How could they possibly defend a dugout carved in stone? One door and no way out? And what would happen if her people learned she was sheltering a white man? Those questions needed answers, and Nita gave them in the way she moved. She knelt by the sleeping shelf and pulled the flat stone aside, revealing the hollow where she had stored her bow and arrows. She handed Cole a small knife, its edge dull but still dangerous. "If they come inside, you fight only if there is no other way. If they find you, they will kill us both." Cole studied her, the firelight throwing shadows across her face. "And what if they already suspect? What if they come to be sure?" "Then I lie," she said simply. "I tell them I am alone. I tell them you were never here." Her jaw tightened. "And you stay hidden no matter what you hear." He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Survival wasn't about pride. It was about making it to the next day. He slid the knife into his boot, then set his revolver back under the blanket, wrapped tight in cloth to keep the shine hidden. By midday, the sound of hooves reached them. Cole's chest clenched. He held her, his chin resting against her hair, her body tense as if waiting for the next knock. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. "They will come again. They never forget." Cole's grip tightened. "Then we'll be ready next time." Both of us. She looked at him then, long and searching, and for the first time she didn't try to push away the truth that they were no longer two strangers caught in the same storm. They were bound now by choice, by danger, by the silent promise that neither would face it alone. The air inside the dugout stayed heavy long after the riders were gone. Cole sat by the fire, his shirt clinging damp to his back, while Nita moved restlessly from shelf to door, her hands never still. Both of them knew the truth that listeners would also demand answers to. How could a single dugout with one bar of wood on the door keep them safe if the riders returned with suspicion in their eyes? What had they done to prepare beyond hiding in a crawl space? And why, despite the danger, did Cole remain instead of leaving under cover of night? Nita finally stopped pacing and crouched near him. We cannot wait for them to come again. If they search next time, they will find you. Cole looked into the fire, jaw tight. He thought of the years he had spent drifting from camp to camp, always moving on before anyone could know him well enough to judge him. He had nowhere else to go, nothing but worn boots and a revolver that hadn't seen proper oiling in months. Then we make this place stronger, he said. The plan began with the back wall. Nita showed him a shallow seam of stone where the earth softened. Together they worked with the dull knife, a chisel head she had salvaged from a trader's wagon, and their bare hands. The hours dragged, but soon a narrow tunnel began to take shape, an escape route that led upward to a ledge shielded by brush. Cole braced it with willow poles while Nita packed clay against the sides to keep it from collapsing. The work left their hands raw and bleeding, but when they finally crawled through to test it, both felt a weight lift. They would not be trapped like animals in a cage. Afterward, Cole cut more wood than before, stacking it high against the wall outside to serve as a false barrier. Nita gathered stones from the creek bed, arranging them in piles near the door where they could be used to block or defend if forced. She explained in a quiet, steady tone that listeners would want to hear why she knew so much about defense. My father taught me before they cast me out. He was a scout. He said a home must never have only one way out. I thought I would never use those lessons, but I kept them. As night fell, the two of them sat by the fire with their backs against the wall, exhaustion pressing down, but relief sharper. Nita's braid had loosened, strands of black hair falling across her face. She was wrapped in Cole's coat again, the torn dress beneath slipping open at the neckline where the stitching had failed. She didn't try to hide it anymore. He tried not to stare, but the quiet between them had changed, no longer just about survival. She turned her head toward him, eyes reflecting the firelight. You could still leave, she said. Her voice carried no challenge, only a tired honesty. Take the tunnel, walk the canyon, vanish before they return. No one would blame you. Cole let out a slow breath. His ribs ached, his hands throbbed, but none of that weighed more than the thought of walking away. I've had enough of leaving, he said. I've left towns, work, graves behind me. Not this time. She studied him, searching for hesitation, but found none. Slowly, she leaned closer until her head rested against his shoulder. His arm went around her without thought, and she stayed there, her breathing evening out for the first time since the knock at the door. The fire burned low. Cole felt her weight against him, warm and steady, and knew the dugout was no longer just her shelter. It was theirs. For the first time since he had staggered through the snow, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like something to dread. It felt like something worth defending. The thaw came slow, dripping from the rim in thin streams that cut into the snow. Cole and Nita worked each morning to keep the dugout clear, hauling wood, checking the tunnel, sharing tasks as if they had lived together far longer than a handful of weeks. But both knew what any listener would ask. What happens when the riders return, when suspicion sharpens into proof, when exile is no longer enough to keep danger away? Would Cole finally walk away to save himself? Or would Nita send him off to keep her own life intact? The answers came sooner than either of them wanted. The sound of hooves carried into the canyon at midday. Not distant this time, but close, too close. Cole stepped to the crack in the door and counted 5 riders, not 3. Their voices carried, sharper now, the tone not of men passing, but of men searching. Nita's face tightened, but she didn't falter. She pulled the bar from the door and turned to him. Stay behind the shelf. If they find you, there is no undoing it. Cole's jaw clenched. I'm not hiding while you stand alone. Her eyes burned into his. If you show yourself, we both die. If you let me speak, maybe we live. He wanted to argue, but the truth of it was solid. So he slid back into the crawl space, knife in his boot, revolver close, every muscle strung tight. He watched through a narrow gap as Nita opened the door. The men dismounted, pushing forward, voices harsh. They demanded to see inside, accused her of lying, of hiding someone. One pointed at the stacked woodpile, saying it looked too fresh, too carefully laid. Nita met their eyes one by one, her voice steady. This is my shelter. I built it. I keep no one here. You can look, but you will find nothing. They pushed past her, boots heavy on the dirt floor. Cole's heart hammered. One of them stopped near the sleeping shelf, the curtain just inches from his face. He reached out, tugging at the edge. Then another called him away, saying there was nothing here but scraps of beans and smoke. For a moment it seemed they would leave, but the youngest lingered, his eyes fixed on Nita. He asked why she had survived when others cast her out. His voice carried suspicion, but also something darker, a threat dressed as curiosity. Nita's jaw set. She lifted her chin. Because I'm stronger than you think. The man sneered, but the elder barked at him, and soon they turned back to their horses. Hooves faded again, snow crunching under iron, until the canyon grew quiet. Cole slid from the crawl space, sweat cold on his back. He found Nita leaning against the door, her shoulders shaking once before she steadied herself. He crossed to her, laying a hand on her arm. She looked up at him, eyes wet but fierce. They will not stop, she said. Not until they believe I am nothing. Cole shook his head. You're not nothing, and you're not alone. The words hung in the dugout, heavier than any silence before. She reached for him, her hands clutching his shirt, and he held her tight, his chin against her hair. For a long while, neither spoke. When they finally pulled apart, the fire had burned low. Cole sat with her beside him, his hand still at her back. We can't just wait for them to come again. We make this ours. A home, not a hiding place. Nita studied him, eyes searching for weakness. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Then we stay, together. That evening they cooked beans and rabbit, eating side by side. Cole marked a plan in the dirt. Where to plant when the thaw opened the creek bed, where to cut a second shelf into the wall, where to set a cradle board if the time came. Nita watched him, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. You speak like a man who belongs here. I do, he answered without hesitation. With you. Night fell, and for the first time, they did not sleep apart. She lay against him, her hand on his chest, his arm around her waist. The storm outside had broken, the canyon breathing quiet. By dawn, the world looked different. The riders might come again, danger might still circle the rim, but inside the dugout the choice had been made. Cole was no longer a wanderer. Nita was no longer alone. Their shelter was not just stone and fire anymore. It was a home, a life built out of exile and survival, held together by the decision to stay. And that was the end of it. Clear, certain, finished. Two lives bound in the canyon, not by chance, but by the choice neither of them would ever turn from again.